Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. We're going to talk today really about estate planning for families that own second homes. So I'm going to go ahead and have my esteemed partner, Phil, go ahead and start talking about second homes and really kind of framing what we're talking about today.
Great, thank you, Kathleen, and welcome everybody. I'm happy everyone has been able to attend this. Second home, it's always a source of pride, joy for your family, but it can also be a lot of work, and if you don't plan right, it could be an absolute aggravation or even worse. But let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of a second home. Certainly, is the personal gratification of having your own place. Particularly if you have like a waterfront home or beachfront property. I mean, as they say, they're not making any more of it, the beachfront. So if you have that, it's certainly a pride of joy. And if you have kids and grandchildren, it's a nice place to have them come and meet you. There's also potential tax benefits. If you mortgage your primary residence, or if this is your primary residence, you certainly get the mortgage interest deduction. If you rent it out, there could be real estate or property tax deductions and other expenses, operating expenses. So certainly if you decide to rent it out, you get the tax benefits that go along with it, but also potentially the headaches, having someone else in your space, in your home. So again, these are things you need to kind of think about ahead of time in terms of how you want to kind of operate the second home. And also there's pride of ownership. It's funny, I know many properties, they're passed down through the generations. Maybe the grandparents bought it, in the 60s, and they, through a legacy and, have, provided to their children, and hopefully it'll be passed on. But there's a lot of issues in doing that. When the property is owned by just the husband and wife, they handle the cost, the maintenance and everything. But when it's passed down, now it's become complications. Who pays for it? How is the use? So issues that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, but something kind of highlight that is both a pro and sometimes a con in terms of a second home.
And so one of the things too, just to add in terms of sometimes people see the ownership of a second home as a way of continuing to build, asset value or equity value by utilizing or buying a second home instead of paying for different vacation options that might be there, building up that equity value within the second home and then increasing your asset holdings overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's part of your whole estate plan, your financial plan, and this certainly can be a component of it as you build it. So let's talk about it now that you've bought your home, you're thinking about it. We always like to start with the end in mind. The ultimate goal is obviously you want to enjoy that second home and then passing it down. But we also refer to a second home as an heirloom property. It was really kind of two dimensions. First of all, the value of it. Is it commercially valuable? And also kind of the sentimental piece of it. Is it cherished by the family? Is this where the family always went to for vacations, weekends, and things of that sort? But now you got to get into the planning piece of it, because as an asset, it could be subject to any creditor claims, or if you have to have nursing home or long-term care expenses. This is an asset of yours. So without proper planning, it could be exposed. Taxes as well. And then eventually, if it is passed to your kids, is subject to their creditors, their marriages, and that could be an issue. It could expose the property. We've been drafting these agreements, and we always recommend an agreement with the family in terms of how you operate it, how is buyout. We'll certainly get into that piece of it later on, but you need to kind of think through how you want this property to be owned by the family, passed through the generations, how it's operated, and also a final disposition. How, if someone's not using it or wants out, how does that person get bought out? So these are all issues better addressed up front than trying to figure out later on where perhaps litigation may ensue. Kathleen?
Whoops, sorry, having a little technical difficulty here.
The suspense is killing me.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So first of all, do you have an heirloom property? This is a question we always ask clients. Is this property worth protecting? This could be your primary residence, by the way. Maybe you're retired and you're living down the Cape, on one of the lakes down there, and the ponds down there, or on the beach, or Rhode Island, or up north. So is it worth it? Is it you consider an heirloom property that your family will enjoy and value over time? But part of the heirloom property quandary is that it has tremendous financial, value to you. Does it have that value? Is it worth protecting and saving through the generations, and all the issues that go along with that? I'll grab the next one, Kathy. Some examples of heirloom properties. I think we're familiar with all these. Your current residence could be, if you have we've actually done planning like for farmers. The farm's been in the family for generations, and how does that protected? How is that passed on? Particularly when you have to consider estate taxes, and how you have to handle various children if someone wants to continue on the farm. Beach houses, country cottages, lake houses, these are all the typical examples of heirloom properties. But again, it kind of goes back to what's important to you and your family.
And I think one of the important things to remember is that, that we use this term heirloom property. It's not a definition that's out there anywhere else, but we kind of use it to describe this type of property. And again, it can have either real financial value. Possibly this is a property that is worth, let's say $1 million more in terms of value. And that's something that you want to either protect or ensure passes on to the next generation, or it has sentimental value. The property may not be worth a lot, but it's one where all the family memories have been made, and people have a tremendous, affinity to the property and remembrance of the property. And so it can have not just financial value, but it may have just sentimental value. And so these are the reasons that we look to protect these kinds of properties. So let's talk a little bit about some.
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Oh, sorry, Phil. Talk a little bit about some of the reasons why you may want to look to save this, what we call heirloom property, or your vacation home. And again, as we talked about, it is the place that has potentially childhood memories, either for you or for raising your family, or for the friends who have had association with the property. It may be a reliable vacation spot for you. So, again, it's the consistency of being able to go to this place and enjoy this place over decades, and really being able to have use and value in that use. It's the place where your family got together. It's, the place where you want everybody to be able to congregate and to be able to enjoy. And as Phil said, the old saying that God's not making any more shoreline, we hear that often, that, these properties, whether they be, beachfront properties, lakefront properties, the truth is that the number of these properties are limited, as the, lakefront shoreline proproperties aren't being created really anymore in terms of space. And so another reason.
I also think the pandemic has affected some of these heirloom properties, particularly people able to work remotely. I know the prices on the Cape and up north in Winnipesaukee have jumped up 20-30% over the prior year. So I think you're going to see a greater value to these desirable properties in the future, certainly in the future.
Yeah, a huge change in terms of people's using these properties, both as not only vacation or homes, but as permanent homes now, where they can do a lot more work from home options. So you need to plan to protect. If you don't do anything, you're not going to end up being able to protect this property from potential concerns. And some of those concerns are estate tax costs and cost of administration of someone's estate after they've passed away. Maybe you're looking to protect it from your own financial issues. You're worried about your own debt. You're worried about your own long-term costs or needs in the future. Maybe this house is something you want to have used as part of the, payment for your long-term needs, and you're looking at it as part of the asset pool that you want to ensure is going to be considered. But if you're wanting to protect it from those future needs, then looking to set up some kind of a planning device is imperative. We also call what we call the killer Ds, which is looking to protect it from future potentials like your children or beneficiaries' divorce that may occur in the future, their debts, their disability in the future, and certainly disputes among family members in terms of how this property is going to be managed as time goes on. We always find that, you know, when the first generation, typically mom and dad, are involved and they own the property and are alive, everything works very smoothly because mom and dad are managing the property. They're taking care of, you know, all of the costs associated or most of the costs associated with the property. They're the ones who are dictating. I'm sorry.
They're setting the rules as well.
They're setting the rules, yeah, dictating
Household,
who gets to use it and when, that kind of thing. And so while mom and dad are alive, everything is going very well. It's after that first generation passes often, or when they're no longer able to manage the property and make decisions about the property, that we begin to see issues. And so planning ahead about how these things are going to be addressed and managed is critical in order to make sure that that property continues to be protected throughout the generations. Remember, protection doesn't just happen. If you don't plan, what do they say? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I think that that's really true when it comes to the management of these second homes. So again, if you fail to provide any kind of special plans, and let's say typically what we see is that the property is just left equally to family members, whether it be children or other beneficiaries. And oftentimes people, if they don't do any special kind of planning, will leave everything equally to those children. So someone has, let's say, 3 children. They don't put any kind of special plan in place. When the death of the second of the parents dies, everything just goes out equally to the children. Now, when we're talking about cash assets and oftentimes other investment assets, those are fairly simple to manage. You split it a third, a third, a third in this particular example. When you're talking about property, however, it's very different. How do you split that property up among the 3 beneficiaries in the example that I'm talking about? How do you make sure that each of them is truly getting that value from the property? And so that's why real estate, and in particular, these second homes, what we call these heirloom homes, really need to have specific planning to ensure that a succession plan succeeds. So some of the things that happen when we leave a home in equal shares, when we're leaving real property, it is that awkwardness that occurs in terms of distribution. So let's take the example of having 3 children. You've got 3 children. One of them lives in, let's say, California, and their family, raising their family in California. You have another child who is nearby and very involved in the property and has been involved over all of these years, helps out at the property, does work at the property, and uses the property a lot. Then you have a third child who may also live nearby, but quite frankly, just doesn't use the property. It's not their cup of tea. They don't really want to go up into the mountains and spend their vacations. They'd much rather travel around the world, let's say. So you've got 3 very different children and 3 very different level of use. Again, when mom and dad are alive and managing the property, it's not really a big issue. Each child uses the property as they can when they want to, and they don't really care in terms of how the expenses are being handled because mom and dad are the ones who are taking care of it. But now mom and dad have passed away and all 3 children have inherited this real property, this heirloom property. Now you're setting it up for issues. How do you determine issues of use? You've got co-owners who have to come up with an agreement around how use is going to occur. And again, you've got one out in California who's never using the property. So for them, getting to use the property a third of the time doesn't really work.
Or how do you handle if suppose they both 2 children want the July 4th weekend? You know, these are operational issues. How do you make that decision?
Right, exactly. The co-management issues that come up. How do you make a determination about whether the roof needs to be replaced? Does the driveway need to be resurfaced? And how are you going to pay for that? Who's going to end up paying for that? And then how does the property continue to get passed down? So again, you have this example of having 3 children who have inherited the property, and one of them passes away and they leave 3 children. Now you have aunt and uncle, or, you have that first level of children managing it with their nieces and nephews. Talk about adding extra stress and extra kind of awkwardness to the situation when you're owning the property throughout multiple generations. So these are the things that really need to be considered when you're leaving these heirloom properties to the next generation. So remember that second homes that become heirloom properties and are passed on, they really require a much higher level of cooperation with the next generation of owners. They have to coordinate around use, around who's going to make decisions about the property, and any financial responsibilities that may need to be there have to all be worked out between the owners.
I'll give you an example as a client we had who has a property up in New Hampshire. They have, it's been passed on to 6 of the children. Well, some of the children live nearby and they want the property to be a year-round property. The other children who live out of state, they're not going to come up here in the wintertime. They're not skiers or anything like that. So should they bear the cost of plowing the driveway, heating, utilities, and things of that nature where they're getting no benefit? So these are kind of things you need to anticipate and kind of think through, these potential issues.
Right. The other thing we've seen in that circumstance is when a child who is not using the property or for some other reason says, I'd prefer to have the value of that property come to me, not the property itself. So how do we make sure that that child is made whole and taken care of in this situation? So it may be that they don't want to own this property. They'd much rather get their share of the value and be able to move on.
And how do you value that? How do you put a number on that? What's the mechanism? What's the process?
Right, exactly. So in the situation where you've got 3 beneficiaries who own the property, 2 of them want to keep it, 1 wants out, who gets to make that call and how does that call get made? So one of the solutions, or the solution that we use, is really using what we call an heirloom ownership trust. And this is a trust that can be a standalone trust, or it can be a trust that's incorporated into a revocable or revocable living trust that you may already have in place. And just a quick background or a quick reminder, a trust, remember, is an agreement that is made between, in this case, the current owners of the property and the people that they want to manage the property, who we call as trustees, and those who will benefit from the property, the beneficiaries or the children or other heirs who may end up inheriting the value of this property. And the nice thing about these trusts is, again, typically put together by the parents who have originally owned the property, if possible, and they then get to lay out what they believe should happen with this property going forward and how it should be managed. So in an heirloom trust, some of the things that we want to really address is what we call the August terms. And what we're looking for is we want to figure out, first of all, what's allocation of ownership look like? Who is going to have ownership of this property as it passes through the generations? And how does that ownership get determined? If an initial beneficiary were to pass away, how does their share go forward in terms of eventual ownership, and who keeps in control of that ownership? We want the trust, under this trust, we want to understand what's the purpose of the trust. So for some families, the decision is we want this property to stay in the family regardless. We don't want it to end up being sold. Not something that we typically recommend, because when you start putting any kind of restrictions on the ability to sell the property in the future, then you really can handicap the ability for some beneficiaries to buy out another beneficiary and free them of the property. So we want to understand what's the purpose. Maybe the purpose is, look, we only want this property to be owned at this level, and the moment that these people pass away, we want this property to be forced into sale. We then say we don't want everybody to have to deal and wrestle with these particular issues. And we believe that the best way to go forward is to sell the property and to allow the beneficiaries to take their interest.
Or if you want to give one of the beneficiaries the right of refusal, you know, if one has the means and the ability, perhaps you allow the trust to permit one of the beneficiaries to buy the property from the others.
Exactly. And under what terms you may want that to, you can set the terms in terms of that. We also want to consider governance issues. So again, one of the things that this type of trust can look at is based on, let's say, usage. Who's going to make decisions about who uses the property and when? Who's going to make decisions about how the property is going to be managed, and who's going to who's going to be making decisions about what, let's say, capital improvements need to be done or what maintenance need to be done. You can set up those governance terms. What happens if you end up with the situation, as I said, in which one of the initial beneficiaries passes away and leaves children, let's say, and now their children step forward to be part of the ownership of the property? Are they going to have a say, or is the initial other two owners going to have a say? So all of this can be worked out ahead of time, and we go through all of these different kind of questions around how the governance should be set up. Again, talking about the use of the property. How do you decide who gets to have the 4th of July or Labor Day weekend or Memorial Day weekend, kind of those big times? Maybe one family really loves to celebrate one of the holidays there. How do you determine which family is going to get that use and come up with some kind of a schedule around the use of the property and who can do it? What if someone says, the child out in California, well, I can't get out there, but I'd like to have my friends come and use the property, or I want to rent out my week that I would otherwise be at the property. What are the terms around that kind of use, and is it allowable? Stewardship of the property. How do you set money aside for the maintenance of the property and the care of the property? Sometimes we look to have the initial owners. They may say, you know what, we want to fund this trust with a certain amount of money to help defer the ongoing costs. Or maybe there is an agreement around the rental of the property and how those rental funds are used maybe to help offset the cost. Or each of the beneficiaries kicks into the value of that stewardship fund to be able to make sure there's always money to handle any kind of needs of the property. The water heater goes, you know, the furnace goes, those kinds of things that might happen when you have property that you're owning. And then we really look at the transfer restrictions, and do we want to put those on? So again, let's say you've got 3 initial children who are the beneficiaries of this trust. One of them dies and has a spouse, and nobody likes the spouse. Do we want to restrict the ability of that child to leave their share to their spouse or to their children? How do we want to handle restrictions on the property's transfer? Maybe we want to say, you can't sell it outside of this group. So if somebody wants out, they have to sell their share to the remainder owners. And how do you determine the price for that sale? So
over what time period do you pay out the funds to the other children? Do you have to be immediate, or is there a time period, months, perhaps years, where the payment is made?
Right, exactly, where someone can buy out the others over a period of time. So again, thinking about all of these important issues ahead of time really does then help to set up a situation of success should the desire be to pass this property on to the next generation, to the next set of beneficiaries, and helps hopefully to keep family relations intact. Because the last thing we want, you know, as you know, parents who have bought a property and, you know, you've enjoyed this property with your family, you've made wonderful memories, etc. there. Everybody's had a wonderful time and enjoyed it. And now you're leaving it to the next level of beneficiaries, and everything falls apart. And the family ends up not speaking to each other. Members of the family no longer have communication with each other. That's the last thing that most people ever want when they're thinking about, the joy of having an heirloom property.
Another consideration, if you have children that just don't get along for whatever reason, families do have that, or children and just can't get along, having them co-owners of a property is even more source of conflict.
Right.
And how do you set that up if that's still your intent, or how do you permit one child to buy out another, or manage it for that source of friction is minimized. So it takes a little bit of work and forethought to kind of avoid that problem.
Right. And this is where it's critical to plan ahead as much as you can. So let's talk about some of the things that these heirloom trusts can do. And it typically is like one or the other. First of all, the individuals themselves can actually, and this would be, let's say, the initial owners of the property, the parents in this example, they're the ones who could actually impose the terms of the agreement on the next generation. They can actually set the terms of that August outlay that we just talked about. They can actually come up with exactly how they want things to be handled. They can dictate all of that within the trust. They can set the terms for the sale and how the governance is going to happen, the usage of the property, etc. Another way that it can be approached is to say, once the next generation steps forward, they have a time frame to which they need to come up with this August agreement. They have to take a look among themselves and come up with an agreement about how they're going to move forward with the management of this property, or then the property, let's say, must be sold. So
trigger it sold.
Exactly. So there's really two approaches. One is for the initial owners of the property who set up the trust to take ownership of the property and pass it on through the generations, for them to actually set up the terms, or to allow the next generation who's going to be taking on that responsibility to set up the terms and work it out among themselves, but set up a specific time frame by which that must occur, or the property must be sold.
And just a cautionary note on the first generation crafting that agreement or imposing it is probably a better term. Sometimes you can't anticipate how the property will be used in the future. For example, in today's environment with the pandemic, a lot of these properties we mentioned are used almost on a full-time basis. Could you envision that 10, 15, 20 years ago? And then also, as you look forward in terms of imposing these agreements, sometimes we don't know what our children's spouses will be like, and if they will be warmly received by all members. So, while we can impose these agreements, it needs to be flexible enough to realize that there's things we can't anticipate, and that we have to permit the trust to have some flexibility in it.
Absolutely. So even in the first instance, as Phil was saying, where that first generation of owners is the ones who put together the August terms, we still want to build in, where appropriate, some flexibility so that it can change and grow as the situation dictates. So another thing to know about these kinds of trusts is that they can be limited in time. So someone can say, look, this agreement is good for the first 5 years as we've written it. And then, as Phil said, give maybe the flexibility that in year 5, the beneficiaries have to get together and come up with their own terms or have to sell. And so you can be flexible in that standpoint about the time frame for it. You can also be flexible in terms of how many generations it may go down. Like, let's say the parents say, this is the agreement that needs to be in place when our children take over. But when that moves forward to the next generation, then here are the terms that have to be considered, or they have to come up with a new agreement. This is the way we can build some flexibility and to allow for changes based on circumstance. Another thing is to have like this commonly used like a 10-year agreement, and then there's a renewal option by the owners by agreement that everyone has to agree. Or maybe they do 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, again, depending on what the wishes are. This is where oftentimes we can build in some flexibility to allow for the agreement to change based on what's happening currently. Another thing, a bunch of other things that these agreements can and should look at. One of it is to provide for some kind of a buyout. As Phil said, you know, you've got an owner who wants out for some reason. How do you make it, how do you set the terms for one child to buy out another child's share, or one beneficiary to buy out another beneficiary's share? And you can do that in a couple of different ways. One of them is to base it on fair market value at the time of the sale. And, you know, maybe you get like a couple of appraisals and you take the average of those appraisals. Maybe you base it on a tax, you know, a tax assessment value. Maybe you give a child that if they're going to buy out another's, they get to do so at a certain discount rate. They set fair market value, but they're able to buy it out for 10% less of that fair market value. As Phil said, do you allow it to have it over time where they can pay that child out over a period of time so that they don't have to come up with the money all at once? So setting the terms for a buyout and how that would occur. And that really takes away, hopefully, the situation in which one child wants out or one beneficiary wants out and the others refuse, or you get legal action starting to happen to force the sale of the property so that that child can get out. The trust can set the price, as we said, many different ways, looking at fair market value, looking at tax assessed value, allowing a child to buy out or a beneficiary to buy out at a percentage reduction, however you'd like to set that price. You can even find ways within a trust to be able to provide funding options in order to be able to keep the property. So, you know, one of the things that we often see is the use of something like a life insurance benefit to be able to help fund the property. Let's say you've got a house down on the Cape and you want to make sure that stays in the family, but none of your beneficiaries really have the ability to be able to pay for that ongoing cost, the property taxes, the maintenance, etc. Well, the grantors, the parents who created this trust to begin with, could have a life insurance policy that pays over to the trust to fund it with a certain amount of money to allow for the continued upkeep over a period of time of that trust. Another thing that that life insurance policy can potentially be used for is to help to defray estate tax costs that may end up coming when the original grantors pass away, the original owners of the trust, of the property. When they pass away, their estates may have a liability. And how do the beneficiaries, the children, pay for that liability without liquidating the property? And one way to do that is to use something like a life insurance policy in order to be able to cover those costs. The last thing is really we use what we call a take it or leave it clause, which says, let's say we've got 3 children again, and you have 2 of them who want to continue to own property and 1 who wants out. So in the trust, we set out all of these things, how a buyout occurs. We can set even the price for that buyout and how that could be even funded. And what we say is, beneficiary, you want out, then you need to take it or leave it based on this. You either decide you're taking it or you don't get anything. This is how you're going to have your buyout happen. And so this gives the original owners, the grantors, a lot of control in taking away the dispute and argument about how a buyout would occur should one beneficiary or more want out of ownership of the property and another wants to buy their share.
Okay, let's talk, well, what would a legal presentation be without a quick case study or a client example we've had in the past? So in this case, mom and dad purchased property for $200,000 years and years ago. As with most heirloom properties, they have substantially increased in value, and now the property is worth over $1 million. In Massachusetts, anything over $1 million for total estate, including non-probate assets, is subject to an estate tax payment. Now, let's just assume this property is worth $1 million, but the total estate is worth $2 million. So it's $100,000 roughly in other assets. There's going to be an estate tax liability, roughly $100,000, just to kind of give you round numbers. How do you pay for that estate tax? Is there cash aside to handle that? Has this been earmarked for for certainly the estate tax, but also the upkeep of the property? So just trying to set the table in terms of the facts. Kathy, if you can just jump to the next slide, if you would. So other issues, if when we're talking with no planning at all, these are some of the consequences that may occur with this, again, this example. And first of all, if it's just in the husband or wife's name, it would have to go through probate. And there's going to be fees, going to be legal fees, filing fees, other fees, and particularly for property of this size and estate, it's not unheard of to have roughly $40,000 in legal expenses and filing fees as well. What happens about the two kids who want to keep the property, but two who don't? Maybe one is going through a divorce. Maybe one has creditor problems. Remember the 4 Ds that could cause a problem? How is that considered? Any other issues that that could occur on this property? And then by looking at this property, is it the parents' intent to pass it down as a legacy property? What can be done now? These are some issues that we need to kind of comprehend at this point.
So some of the things that we'd look at when we're kind of looking at this example of an estate is, again, one of our first things that we want to try to do is avoid that whole probate situation. We would like to make it so that when the second of the original owners, the grantors, we'll call them in this case, pass away, we want to try to make it so that we're not dealing with probate and reducing or eliminating the cost associated with probate. So the use of something like a revocable trust can be very beneficial in this case. Mom and dad put that together during their lifetime, put the ownership of the property and their other appropriate assets into it, so that when the second of them dies, we have eliminated the need to go through probate, involve the courts, and have those additional fees associated with it. And so absolutely, that's a kind of a quick and in many ways a no-brainer, take a solution to being able to make sure the property can pass. Now, we don't want it to pass, well, maybe we do. We want it to pass equally to the children, but going through again those August terms, including an heirloom trust within this revocable trust planning situation, really will help to address the issues of leaving equal ownership to the children, talking about how they're going to manage it, what the expectations will be in terms of use, governance, all of those things that we had addressed already. We want to make sure that those are addressed within the revocable trust so that the children are inheriting the property, but there's very clear guidelines in terms of how that inheritance will work and the use of the property will be addressed. Now, we also, again, want to address if one of the kids wants out. They don't want to be part of the property ownership anymore. They're not going to get their value and their use out of owning this property with their siblings. They want to be able to get their value directly. So within the trust, we talk about how a buyout would work and what will happen if one or more of the beneficiaries want out. Now, one of the benefits of keeping the property in ongoing trust is that, let's say some of the beneficiaries are going through some issues on their own. They're going through a divorce and they don't want this asset to be part of their asset holdings and potentially now get in the hands of what will be eventually the ex-spouse. Maybe they're subject to debt. They really don't know how to handle money well and they have a lot of debt. And if they inherit a certain portion of this property, they're going to end up having that value go to creditors. keeping the property in ongoing trust, but making the children beneficiaries without being the ones who control the property per se, allows it to be protected from much of this aspect of their life. If they don't control it, if instead it is controlled by a trustee under the terms that we've outlined in that August agreement, the child can use the property, but not have the property considered part of their asset holdings, and thus not part or being subject to divorce agreements that may be occurring, divorce situations, debts that the child may have, etc. So addressing these things ahead of time can make it much smoother for someone to be able to still benefit from the property, but not have it considered part of their asset holdings. Now, in the slide before, it talked about a liability of about $100,000 that would have to be paid given the size, let's say, of this overall estate of $2 million. How do we make sure that that can get covered? If we don't fund the trust with monies, we don't provide a pool of liquid cash, the children may be faced with the situation of having to sell the property just to pay off something like a tax liability. So again, thinking through what other assets are there that one may be able to use to help pay any liability like a tax liability, or to be able to fund the ongoing use maintenance of the property. Can they use something like a life insurance policy, the proceeds from a life insurance policy? Do retirement funds get directed into that? They have their own tax consequences, and so you'd have to think through that carefully. But are there other assets that should be funneled into the trust to ensure that there's access to liquid money to be able to pay for tax liabilities, ongoing property expenses associated with the property? And so we want to make sure that the trust addresses all those issues. But by doing so ahead of time, you really can help to address concerns about ongoing costs, concerns about ownership and use, concerns about beneficiaries' debt, and what may happen to that beneficiary as they go forward. So looking to address as much of that ahead of time as you can. So remember, what a trust is, and there are two types of trusts, although there's a million different kinds of trusts out there. There's two categories of them. The first is revocable trusts. Those are ones that the creators, the grantors of that trust, retain control over the trust, but they also continue to have usually tax ownership of that trust. And then there can be irrevocable trusts. And this is where the ownership now is with the trust and not with the original grantors. And an irrevocable trust can also be a great way to allow a child to potentially benefit from the trust without having any kind of ownership interest in the trust itself. They could have use of the property without actually having ownership of the asset that is held by the trust. So you want to talk really carefully about, again, what your purpose of the trust is to determine which type of trust would be most appropriate, a revocable trust or revocable trust, or an irrevocable or irrevocable trust. So let's talk a little bit about using particularly the revocable trust, because that's really the one that we see most often used with our heirloom trust language. Remember, the biggest advantage of a revocable trust is that when it is funded fully, it allows us to avoid the whole probate proceeding. So it allows us, number one, to have the property owned by the revocable trust. The grantors, or the parents in this situation, would be still in control of the trust. They could change the terms of the trust if they chose to in the future, and they get to dictate, if they want, how those August agreement or August terms are addressed, or they can make the decision to leave that up to the next generation, but tell them if they don't come up with those terms within a period of time, then the property must be sold. They also want to, again, look at that trust and determine how's the best way to fund it to make sure that liabilities such as taxes can be handled and the ongoing upkeep, maintenance of the property, particularly after the grantors have both passed away. How is that going to continue to happen? And they'll look at different sources. Again, life insurance policies, sale of other properties, potentially retirement plan benefits, and other investment properties that investment holdings that they may have to help fund that. And that would be the next step, is to look at what's the most efficient way to be able to help to fund and meet the goals of the trust. So when we use a revocable trust, again, we have the original husband and wife, or in this case, the original grantors. They set up a revocable trust. They continue to be in control of everything. They continue to make all of the decisions about what happens with the property while they're alive. Upon their death, then what happens is the revocable trust will go into an ongoing trust for the benefit of the children, and the decision about whether they have already determined the August terms in the original trust, or do they allow that to be done by the next generation within those timeframes that we talked about, having to get them done or having to sell the property itself. And then we look at, how do we fund that trust? How do we make sure that monies are available to pay for any tax liabilities that might be there, or how we make sure that monies are available for ongoing maintenance and support of the property, if that's what the grantors want to see happen. So some things, again, to think about: heirs who are not interested in the property, how can they end up being bought out and the other beneficiaries are able to retain the property? How are estate taxes going to be handled when the original owners of the property pass away? And how do they make sure that the next generation succeed in terms of this co-ownership agreement or co-ownership situation, and even allow it to continue on for the next generation after? How do we make sure that we set them up for success? That's the purpose of the Heirloom Trust. Well, I think it's a lot of information that we shared, but I think if there's a takeaway that I'd like everybody to think about, is really that planning when you own second homes is imperative. That if you just go ahead and say, I'm going to leave it and let the next generation figure it out, understand that they really are going to be duking it out potentially, and that this is something that you really want to avoid where you can. A little bit of planning ahead really can be beneficial for the next generation, and potentially allow this property to continue to be held for many, many years to come.